Well, folks, Marvel Snap's September season of cards have been officially revealed, which means it's time to formally review them. We're going to talk about each of these cards, rate them from 1 to 4 stars, and then also rank them on how impactful I think they're going to be in the meta from best to worst. And I think we've got one really crazy card in this video, one really fun card in this video, and 2 others that might also be in the mix as well. So could be a pretty big month. That said, we're going to kick it off here with the season pass card for the month, which is Loki. And for our good friend Loki here, he is a 3/5. Keep in mind he was a 3/4 in previous data mining, so he's gotten a little bit of a buff. His on reveal reads, replace your hand with cards from your opponent's starting deck and give them -1 cost. So definitely a bit of a trickster here playing with your opponent's stuff. We've already built some pretty fun and somewhat capable decks that rely on that game plan, and the fact that your opponent's stuff is getting discounted, I think actually makes this a pretty intriguing option, because right now in the Marvel Snap meta, we have so many tempo decks that are just trying to get stats down on board. They don't necessarily have super specific synergies or combos or game plans they're trying to unlock. They're just playing, Silks and Spider-Mans and Darkhawks and Black Bolts, and it's just good stats. And with a card like Loki, that's a great sign, because you're going to get a hand that's not required to synergize or play things in order or have a perfect sort of curve. You're just going to get stuff that you can play. And that means that your stats are going to be more efficient than your opponents, because you're going to have -1 cost on all of them. So the hope here, I think, is that you're playing a really fine 3-drop, good base stat line here at a 3/5 for Loki. And then hopefully you're going to get some stuff that just allows you to overwhelm your opponent, gaining small edges here and there, cheating out slightly bigger things a turn sooner, playing that Black Bolt a turn before them on turn 4, playing a Legion a turn early, right? And just kind of outpacing them a little bit because of all those discounts. You're also, of course, still going to be able to top deck your own stuff in future turns, so you're not going to be completely reliant on your opponent's hand. It might just occasionally help you fill in some curves and fill in some gaps. So I think in this kind of tempo stat-based meta that we have in Marvel Snap right now, Loki actually looks like a really, really good card. Now, of course, that means if we get other metas that shift and change and have more, distinct synergy plans and combo lineups, Loki might just get a bunch of junk in hand that's hard to use. If you get a Cerebro, this might be tough to use. If you get a Mystique, but you don't get the other ongoing card to go with it, it's like, crap. Okay. So the more sorts of cards like that exist in the meta, the weaker Loki gets. So this might be a card that kind of comes and goes in and out of fashion as metas sort of ebb and flow based on just how much they care about stats versus synergies or game plans. Now, that said too, though, you also have some probably choice about when you're going to play Loki. You don't always have to play him necessarily. If you have other alternative lines you can take, maybe this isn't the right matchup for Loki. Maybe you think it's a Cerebro deck. Maybe you think it's a deck that's just not going to offer you enough stats or efficiency, and you're really worried. You just hold the Loki. Maybe you play him on turn 6 as just an efficient 5-power play because you didn't want to risk losing your hand, or you have a good curve, you just don't want to disrupt it. So I think the luxury of choice here helps for a card like Loki as well. You're not required to play this. You're not required to make that sacrifice. But in some games where your hand sucks, in some games where your opponent's cards seem like they'd be really spicy for you, that might be the moment you slam Loki and really stand to benefit. It's also worth noting, of course, there are the obvious synergies like Silver Surfer, potentially, like Cerebro 5 is a possibility. We always talk about these sorts of things with cards, costs, and powers. I don't think either of those are very compelling. Silver Surfer is risky because, of course, if you play Loki, you're going to lose your Silver Surfer unless you waited until turn 6, like we talked about. But probably just not consistent enough for a Surfer deck. Cerebro 5, still a meme, and this really wouldn't help. You get a bunch of cards that would not support your Cerebro 5 game plan. So neither of those seem like viable options here for Loki. That said, I think still a card with quite a bit of potential, and one that could pop into the meta here and there. Cost discounts are good, and your opponent's decks are generally pretty good, and I think those combined is going to make Loki an interesting option. So moving on, this is the card that has everybody terrified. This is Alioth. And Alioth actually used to cost 5 energy in some of the early data mining, has now been pushed to 6, which I think is definitely a big change, because before you could play this on 5 and then you could Absorbing Man on 6, which sounded completely busted and totally insane. Now it's 6. I think Alioth is still a pretty good card, actually. I think he still has a lot of potential power with this on reveal. Destroy all enemy cards played here this turn, including unrevealed cards. So basically, this is a really big I win button in a given location late in the game. If you're ahead, or even if you're down by 4, presumably, Alioth will very much win you that location 99% of the time. There are certainly instances where your opponent could move stuff in, or drop a Dr. Doom or something and fill the space after Alioth has revealed. But most of the time, a vast majority of the time, Alioth is an I win button in a given location, assuming you have enough power there, which is definitely scary and crazy and makes me nervous. There are a couple different use cases for that. Number one, you've just built an insurmountable advantage in another location. Alioth assures you a second location. Boom, game over. I think another great use case for this is lockdown decks. Just lock down a location early in the game, get ahead there, know that your opponent can't play it. You got Storm into your Juggernaut, Storm into a big Darkhawk, whatever it is, that's sealed, and then focus all of your efforts into that final spot, that third spot. Play something big on 5, play Alioth on 6, boom, you're good to go. There are even some like Galactus lines with this, where you cheat out a Galactus early with Wave or something, and then you use Alioth to seal the deal in that location, making sure your opponent can't actually contest that singular location that you've Galactused as well. So I actually think this works across a lot of different vectors here. You've got like tempo decks that can use this as a big payoff late. You've got lockdown decks that can really isolate locations. You got Galactus that really isolates locations into an Alioth. And ultimately, it feels like one of those cards that's just, it deletes so much power. It is potentially so swingy that a lot of different decks are going to find an excuse to run this one, because it's just like you're going to create game states where this just works, and you know it's going to win you, and that gives you the confidence to make big plays, big snaps, and I think that's going to be very powerful in the meta. I think Alioth has the chance to be one of those cards we see in a ton of different decks, which pop up from time to time, but might be necessary. I think 6 drops right now are a little bit weak. Seems like the game is really playing, 3s through 5s right now. We need some big 6s to make some disruptions. Alioth could absolutely be that sort of card. So moving on here, we have Ravonna Renslayer, a 3/3 with ongoing. Your cards with 1 or less power cost 1 less, down to a minimum of 1. That's a lot of 1s. But here we have another cost discount card, which I think is always something you have to keep an eye on. Always seems really scary. As we've seen in the past, Sarah dominated the meta forever. Zabu is still dominating the meta, and Ravonna here could be another way to do that. Now, she is very specific compared to some of those other cards, because Sarah and Zabu, of course, let you play a lot of power while discounting. Zabu, you can slam big Darkhawks. Sarah, you can just play a billion different things, of course, but still play big, awesome hit monkeys or whatever you want, right? So you weren't really capped on your power output per discount. Ravonna is saying, hey, look, you're going to get some cool discounts, but only for specific sorts of cards. And I think that's going to make her less of a general utility sort of thing and more of a specific deck enabler. So unlike Sarah or Zabu, which feel like they can just go across the meta and do lots of different things, Ravonna's probably going to need some really specific use case to feel good. Now, that said, I think there might still be some specific use cases, right? Number one is something like a Mr. Negative deck. You already know your Mr. Negative deck is running a lot of cards with 0 power, because that's what you want. You want to flip them and make them go to Mr. Negative. Now, obviously, you don't want Ravonna in the world where you've played Mr. Negative, because all of those cards, like, your Iron Man is now at 0/5, doesn't need to be discounted, number one, and number two can't be, because he now has 5 power. But it could maybe be a sort of backup plan where it's like, okay, I didn't hit the Mr. Negative, but I'm not totally hopeless, because if I play Ravonna on 3, I can play Iron Man on 4, my Iron Heart's 2. It basically turns her into like a Sarah for a Mr. Negative deck as a backup plan. The question is whether or not that deck needs a backup plan. Right now, the way Mr. Negative decks play is like, look, I hit it, I'm going all in, I'm snapping for 8, I'm going to win those games really big. If I don't hit Mr. Negative, I'm out, I'm just taking my retreat. And trying to bridge the middle of that with kind of a stopgap card like this one may not be worth it. The deck may like that really feast or famine style of play and just make sure they're going for it, because, this is not a card you want to hit after playing Mr. Negative, for instance. You don't want to draw 3/3 Ravonna immediately after playing your Mr. Negative. So there are obviously some opportunity costs and risks to running something like this in a Mr. Negative deck. So could you build a sort of flatter Mr. Negative deck that's more consistent, and would that be worth it because of a card like this? I'm not totally so sure. So another angle for this could be just something like Cerebro 3, actually, which I think is kind of intriguing. Cerebro and Mystique are both cards that you want to play, obviously, in a Cerebro 3 deck, and Ravonna does make them cheaper, which is kind of intriguing. So you could maybe set up for like a turn 6, Cerebro for 2, Mystique for 2, and then play another card, you know, your Sentinel or whatever it is, to both build, you know, a nice buff, but also contribute a little bit of extra power, because sometimes that turn 6 Cerebro Mystique is predictable and doesn't really let you shift power around so much as just get taller, which the opponent can kind of figure out very often. It also means, though, you can actually play it on turn 4, which is risky for things like Enchantress sometimes, but still could be worthwhile in certain matchups. You know, like, okay, I'm just going to get these down early, or maybe split them so, you know, I don't have to take so many risks on turn 6. I'm not as predictable. Those sorts of things are possible for Ravonna. So that's one angle to keep in mind. I'm not totally sold on that one either. So the two premises so far, not really convinced for Mr. Negative, not super convinced for C3. So kind of iffy there. The other angle for this might be something like an on reveal deck. There are some cards, you know, like White Tiger, for instance. Suddenly that becomes like a 4/8 because it's now 4 energy with Ravonna. And, you know, we talked about like Ironheart before. A lot of on reveal cards bake their value into the on reveal as opposed to their power level. So in some cases that might be worth it. Build some kind of like Sarah on reveal deck type plan without Sarah necessarily, but maybe with Sarah too. Who knows? You could combine those. And that could be another angle for this card. I'm not sure there is enough density of those if you look right now to really make that worth it, but something you kind of keep in mind, maybe, you know, plan that for later potentially. So all in all, you know, options exist for this card. I'm not convinced any of them are super good options just yet. This feels like one of those things where people are gonna, you know, build some pet decks, and like we'll have some awesome videos out of it. We'll build a C3, we'll build a Mr. Negative, we'll have some good moments, but I don't know that this will necessarily rise to an actual meta relevance, at least right away. This is one of those cards that certainly gets better over time. And Marvel Snap cards, as far as we know, are just around forever. So in 6 months, could this card be really good with, you know, a handful of more 1 power things or 0 power ongoing cards? Yeah, maybe you could build a deck that weaves enough of that together. And it's possible there's some magic concoction right now. You know, you just stack a bunch of Angelas and Iron Hearts and Iron Mans in a deck, and you've got like a cheaper earlier game Sarah. It's not impossible. I think there's potential here. It's just going to require a really specific sort of build or more cards to make this feel worth it, which right now I think Zabu is probably more reliable. Sarah, probably a bit more reliable and at least universal in its use cases. So one to watch. It's just going to take a minute. So finally here we have Mobius M. Mobius, a 2/3 ongoing. Your costs can't be increased and your opponent's costs can't be reduced, which is really interesting because, of course, we just talked about Ravonna, we've talked about Zabu and Sarah endlessly, and we know obviously cost reduction can be a very powerful asset in the Marvel Snap meta. And this could be a way for decks to counter that and limit it and say, hey man, look, I'm not going to let you wreck me with your crazy Zabu sorts of plays. Also, of course, various locations can be beneficial here for Mobius, where, you know, you benefit from Elysium, but your opponent doesn't, or you don't have to worry about Dream Dimension because of your Mobius. So both, you know, deck counter potential, location relevance as well. Now, the thing for a card like this one, and I've seen this in card games a lot, it pops up over and over again, is that is your deck going to be willing to bear the burden of countering other people's decks? In other words, this is sort of a tech card against cost discounts, but it's only a tech card that is good in a limited number of scenarios. In other words, there will be, you know, half your matchups or something where this just really doesn't matter. If you're playing against a destroy deck, you've just played a 2/3, and you're probably pretty sad that your card wasn't very good and you could have been running something better. With mini tech cards, you know, it's worth it because they have such crazy swing potential, or they work in just so many matchups. Like Shang-Chi, it just works. You know, it's gonna find so many plays. It's so swingy and so big. Mobius is number one, a little bit harder to see just how effective it was sometimes, and number two, is just dead so often that I think most decks are going to say, yeah, it's not for me. I've got my own proactive game plan. I'm looking to do my own thing. I don't really think Mobius makes all that much sense. Especially in a ladder environment, there might be worlds in Conquest where, you know, there's some, you know, really hot deck that everybody's playing. Lamby series just put out some new list and it's got Sarah or whatever. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to use Mobius to get a really big advantage because I'm expecting to see this in my Conquest run a lot. And, you know, that's nice for those sorts of moments to exist. But on ladder in particular, I feel like this is going to be too dead too often for most people to care about it. And I don't think protecting the costs of your own cards will be a consistent enough upside that decks need that either. Like, there's nothing so vitally important to play at specific moments that you have to run Mobius. You can probably just take those losses if Dream Dimension really screws you. You're not going to run Mobius to avoid Dream Dimension, you know, 1 out of 30 times or whatever that it shows up. You just take that retreat. You know, that's the great thing about the cube system, is that you don't need necessarily to bring up the floor of a deck like that, because the floor already is protected by the cubes. Like, you know, you're not going to be risking a ton of cubes to bad rolls like that, because you can just exit out with 1 cube. So cards like Mobius that ensure that it's not necessarily, you know, all that important. Just run other better cards instead. I have seen some talk about this with Wave, and like maybe using this to enable something like Death Wave, where your death is at 0 or whatever, and you use Mobius to keep it at 0 so that Wave can't push it up to 4. I've also seen debates about whether or not that will work. I don't know if that's going to work 100%, but that is a possibility for this card. That said, you know, you need to be destroying things in a Death Wave deck by turn 5. I guess you could play the Mobius on 5 with Wave and have set up all of your like Death Wave enablers earlier. I still don't know if that will create a double stack on Death like it used to. Like, used to, Death would go to 4 and then reduce itself. Would instead Death go to its real cost, and then if it's above 4, Wave pulls it down to 4, and if it's below 4, but say it's like 2 for instance, does it stay at 2? It doesn't maybe double stack from 4 to 0. It just goes down to 2 and it stays there, because Wave can't increase it, but Wave is also not necessarily decreasing it. I don't know how that works. Who knows? I don't really think that's again a reason to run Mobius though. That doesn't feel like such a powerful line or a consistent enough line that you don't have to rely on this. So interesting to think about. I'm curious how you guys think that's all going to work and shake out, but probably still not a reason that this card looks very good to me. So I feel like I said a lot there, but maybe not very concisely or conclusively. In essence, I think Mobius is a tech card that not many people are going to be willing to run, and as an enabler probably just won't be strong enough. So I think a fairly limited utility for this one. Alioth is a 4-star card. Loki is a 3-star card. Ravonna Renslayer is a 3-star card. Mobius M Mobius is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for the September reviews. I'm not the biggest fan of the theme of this month. Like, I actually like the Loki TV show a lot, but for some reason, people in suits, you know, just aren't the most like exciting characters in Marvel Snap for me. You know, like the big angry cloud is also maybe not that exciting either. But Loki's obviously pretty cool. Everybody loves Loki. But I think the card designs are actually quite cool. There's some fun stuff happening with the designs, just the theme, flavor, whatever. Maybe not my favorite, but very excited to play Loki for sure. I am actually going to be out of town a little bit when Loki comes out, so I may not have the best video right away for Loki, but nonetheless, I'll do my best. So yeah, all that said, thanks for watching. Share all your thoughts below. You think these cards are going to be good or bad? I am very curious to hear your takes. How are you going to use these? So on and so forth. Thanks for watching, and until next time, game on.